Hi everybody, welcome to the Scaled Agile and 3-2-1 GAG webinar on achieving regulatory and industry standard compliance with the Scaled Agile Framework, or SAFE. My name is Bria Schecker. I am the Senior Marketing and Operations Manager here at Scaled Agile, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Before we get started with introductions and go through the agenda, can everybody just drop a note in the comments if you can hear me okay, and if you can see the presentation screen okay? Great. Looks like everything is working properly. Thank you. So throughout this presentation, feel free to drop any questions that you have into the questions box. We'll do our best to get to everybody's questions, but this is quite a large webinar with a lot of you on there, which is incredibly exciting. So if there are any questions that we are not able to address within the webinar, we will do our best to send a written recap when we send out the recording of this webinar via email. I'll also try to give priority to the questions that apply to the most attendees. If it's more specific or case by case, we'll do our best to get to those in a follow-up email as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce today's presenters. We have Dr. Steve Maynor, SAFE Senior Program Consultant for Scaled Agile. So he's an SPCT, SAFE Senior Program Consultant Trainer. We also have Harry Kahneman, Director of Technology at 3-2-1 GAG. Those will be our presenters today, and again, this will be recorded. We will be sending out a recording and a recap email within the next few days or so. And without further ado, I will pass it over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Bria, and thanks everybody for being on the call. Again, my name is Dr. Steve Maynor. I'm with Scaled Agile, and I'm very happy to be here. And again, thanks for taking your time out for this session. Just a quick background: most of my experience that directly relates to the regulatory and governance conversation comes from spending about the last 15 years working with the federal government for different IT systems integrators and seeing how that plays out with Lean and Agile at scale. So that'll be the direction that I'm coming from and will be contributing to the conversation. Harry, you want to give a brief background of what brings you to this conversation?
Sure. Like you, I spent the last 15 years or so doing a lot of defense work, not IT, mainly in systems and missile systems and control systems and radar systems. But as well, I spent quite a bit of time in medical device, aerospace, as well as quite a bit of time with automotive. So, and all those folks have regulatory compliance needs and concerns.
Terrific. Well, I know we've certainly enjoyed working together and putting this together for the fine folks on the call. I know we've got a lot to cover. So let's go ahead and dive into it. This is the agenda for our time together for the next hour or so. So we're going to give a brief background on this conversation of product development and in a regulatory compliance-driven industry and what happens when that world collides with the shift toward lean, agile process and practice. After that, we'll go into some specific things that SAFE brings to the table in terms of how to bring those two worlds together. We'll focus on these four things that you see on the screen: how to build the solution and compliance incrementally, how to organize for value and compliance in a lean, agile way, and then building quality and compliance in throughout the product development process and applying continuous verification and validation. So that's the path that we'll follow, and then we'll summarize at the end and address any questions. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass the baton to Harry, and Harry's going to get us started on our journey in this topic. So Harry, it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Steve. As you mentioned, I'm going to advance the slide there. Thanks. So we want to set the stage by talking about how regulatory requirements and Agile kind of can work together. Next slide, please, Steve. So in in general, right, compliance, our goal, well, let's talk about setting the stage. In general, we want to show how we want to make compliance progress more visible and the compliance activities part of the regular flow. So it's very similar to what we saw with Deming decades ago in the lean movement, in terms of if we want to see better quality, well, we need to build quality in as part of the regular activities that we do. And traditional development runs afoul of these types of challenges with the large batches and delaying feedback and creating big bow ways of testing and compliance activities towards the end of building the system. Typically with regulatory compliance, we schedule compliance activities months, if not years in advance, and the lack of the uncertainty and lack of knowledge on whether we're going to meet those types of windows is concerning and big economic risk as well. And we have great people doing these efforts and this work, and as Deming found out, it's typically not the people, but the system by which the people working that are the challenges, right? Those large batches, slow feedback that are giving us the worst outcomes and the lower quality. And the last bullet there, it's kind of an oddball in that list, but we also have no way really to leverage compliance knowledge. We've got engineers and developers, a lot of them doing Agile now, that are trying to continuously improve, yet we've got compliance people that are handing them kind of check sheets to say, hey, do these activities. So there's no real way to try to improve flow with that compliance knowledge. And those are some of the topics we want to talk about today. Next slide, Steve. So we've got these two communities. They have their individual goals or individual agendas, and they appear to not be aligned. You've got the regulatory compliance folks and quality, safety, security that are doing audits and sign-offs and inspections and reviews and verification validation, and they're concerned about specifications, right? Every one of those regulatory agencies, those icons on the bottom, the FDA, et cetera, they'll say we need a specification, right? You have to do your verification validation against a baseline specification. Yet on the Agile side, we value working software over comprehensive documentation, right? If I have a specification, how am I going to respond to change, right? I don't want to plan, I want to be able to respond and adapt to change. And we welcome change requirements. It seems to conflict with that notion of do a specification and do it early. So we have these conflicts that we're going to have to resolve. If you ask the business, though, do you need to meet compliance and regulatory? You need to meet your regulatory compliance goals. They're going to say, of course we do, right? We can't ship a medical device product, or we have risk of lawsuits or economic problems if we don't do our credit card processing securely. So of course the business needs to meet regulatory compliance. But do you also need lean and agile principles to better address your customer needs and learn what your customers' goals are? Of course we need both, right? So we need to have a system that helps us meet regulatory compliance, yet at the same time gives us the value that we see with the lean and agile practices, and that's our goal today. Next slide, Steve. So we need to demonstrate several things, actually. The first thing we have to be able to demonstrate from a client's perspective, or one of the things we have to demonstrate, is we built the right solution, right? We have a specification. We talked about that before, that says here's what the system does, and we've got the evidence that the system actually meets those specifications. It complies with it, not just what the system does, but also a lot of times what it doesn't do, some non-functional requirements, some things that the problems that it won't cause. We also have to show that we built the system the right way, right? That it meets its intended purpose, so that it addresses the customer's needs. Customers or operators can use the system without causing harm to themselves or others. And then last but not least, we also have we have to show that we have the objective evidence that we've met those goals and agendas. And that's where this notion of a quality management system comes into play. So the quality management system, go to the next slide, please, Steve. That quality management system, that is our that's our set of practices and processes and policies at our organization that addresses how we are complying to statutory regulations, to government agency regulations, to potentially customers. Customers a lot of times walk in, especially in a supply chain and automotive or defense, they walk in with their rules and guidelines as well. And then in general, there's industry best practices that we need to follow, right? In case we don't want to be sued, right? So there's industry best practice out there that we need to follow as well. And it's really the quality management system. Now that term's well known in the medical device community, and it's also pretty well known in other communities, aerospace, automotive, typically by the regulatory people. The engineering folks probably have not heard that term as much, but the regulatory folks probably have. but every one of those organizations understands the principle, the policies and practices that they do have to follow. One of our concerns with this talk is that each one of those regulations is subject to interpretation by us, right? Well, some of them are not, right? So some statutory regulations are not subject to interpretation. For example, there's stopping distance for vehicles, right? That's kind of a mandatory law, for example. But for example, how we protect and encrypt credit card information, right? Well, there's laws, there's rules for that, but kind of it's our interpretation on how we're going to realize those rules that's part of our quality management system. And often those regulations, they have a lot of room for how we implement them. And a lot of that how ends up becoming lore and gospel within the organization, not to be questioned. Well, in Lean and Agile, we like to question things all the time. You know, why are we doing this? In fact, sometimes we ask why 5 times, as a matter of fact. But we're constantly questioning why do we need to make these things happen. So that's one of the sentiments, again, for this talk is that we want to be concerned with meeting regulatory requirements, but being flexible in the interpretation of how and getting teams involved with the best way to realize that how. Okay? Who best to realize how to build quality in than the teams? Same with who best to realize how to build compliance in if it's not the teams, right? So we need their guidance on how best to build this type of stuff in. Okay, next slide, please, Steve. So there's really 2 types of compliance. It really comes in 2 forms. So another thought process for today's talk is we absolutely have compliance on our solution. You know, we mentioned how we manage credit card information from PCI standards. If I'm in the automotive industry, I've got all kind of laws, frankly, about stopping distance and fuel economy and all kind of other things we have to meet. So absolutely there's compliance rules, statutory, regulatory compliance rules on the solution. But there's also rules on the process. Not only do we have to ensure our product complies, we also have to make sure our process complies as well. You know, medical device, in fact, every one of those regulatory agencies, there is a SRS, a software requirement specification or system requirement specification that has to be baselined and used for both verification and validation. So automotive as well. Automotive has rules about independence, right? That there is an objective and independent assessment of the quality of the system. It's not just developers peer reviewing. There's an outside, there's an independent, again, subject to interpretation, group of folks that are assessing the quality of the system. And we have to have the objective evidence both that the product complies as well as the process complies to meet our goals. Okay, next slide. I think, Steve, here you're going to talk about how Waterfall does an excellent job of helping us realize those goals, right? Yeah,
absolutely. And it's a good point, Harry, that not only do we have requirements in a regulatory and compliance environment for how we build the product, but also the process that we follow. And much like in traditional IT software and systems development, even outside the regulatory and compliance conversation, Waterfall has been our way of thinking for so long. I mean, for 30, 40 years, we've just assumed that this is the way that we're supposed to work. And as you mentioned before, it almost becomes lore, because if you really look at many of these guidelines that either come from agencies or that organizations themselves have written, there's almost an assumption there, but oftentimes there's a lot more flexibility actually in the letter of the regulation than organizations assume there is, and so they just assume that it has to be done this way. And of course, as we all know, that waterfall process can lead to some of these same challenges, especially in a regulatory and compliance environment. Imagine things like the little visibility into the process. And if you talk to people whose job it is to perform these compliance tasks, that is their world. They usually don't see what's coming at them until it's time to work with it, and then here come the issues. That creates a late learning, which leads to late delivery, and many of the other things you see on the screen there. And I love this quote from Dean, because he really summed it up very nicely, is that any notion that we are mandated to follow this waterfall model is a myth, and it's perpetuated more by the "we've always done it this way" mentality than it is in the actual regulations themselves. And I saw this so many times working with different federal agencies that had agency level SDLC regulations and guidelines, and when you read them, that it's not actually mandating how to do something. The guidance is much broader. The assumption that we have to follow waterfall is really more of the baked into the lore and just the general practice of the organization. So with that as the backdrop, what we are going to reference several times throughout this presentation today is the Scaled Agile framework and how SAFE, it gives us some great success patterns that have been collected from very large organizations implementing Lean and Agile, implementing SAFE in these regulatory and compliance-heavy environments. So for those that may not be as familiar with SAFE as others, so SAFE, in a nutshell, it's a freely revealed knowledge base of integrated, proven success patterns for enterprise Lean Agile product and systems development. It really is a collection of things we've seen work well in organizations across the globe. And the address at the bottom, the scaledagileframework.com, will take you to a site where you'll get a picture that looks like this. The thing that I will share about this is it's a visual navigation tool to a repository of hundreds of guidance articles that are behind each and every icon and word that you see on the screen, that goes into greater detail about that process, that role, that artifact, and it represents how do we take the Lean Agile practices that we all know and are pretty familiar down at the team level, which you see at the bottom of that picture. But as you go into very, very large enterprises, and those that have to comply in this regulatory compliance world are often very large, very complex organizations, the other levels reflect the other roles and practices that it takes to integrate many, many teams together. In fact, we call this 4-level SAFE because in version 4.0 we added that third up from the bottom level called the value stream, and there are several things that we reflected in practice when we added that layer that are going to come up throughout the rest of this webinar that we find very, very helpful. In fact, they are on the big picture is what we call this. They're on the big picture directly because of feedback that we got from customers that live in these worlds that asked for something to reflect the level of complexity and rigor that they have to apply in these kinds of high assurance types of environments. So we'll come back to what some of those are and how that can really help organizations that are having to deal with these kinds of issues. So the big picture then is this. We have on the left-hand side all of these various governmental and agency level requirements that organizations who are doing product development in each of these industries and spaces must account for in their product development cycle. As Harry talked about, we have a general term that's largely understood called the Quality Management System, or the QMS, that is the umbrella term. And then below that icon on the screen, you see 3 specific ideas: the solution intent, quality practices, and the end solution, that are actually lifted from the framework. And we're going to talk in more detail about each of those 3 and how the success patterns we've collected around each of those can help guide organizations in terms of building in the compliance process earlier and iteratively throughout the product development process, and aimed both at, as you see on the top note there, the product requirements as well as the process and procedure requirements that lead to the tangible objective evidence that you often have to provide to these oversight agencies that show that we have in fact followed the guidelines that each of these agencies set forth. So that sets the broad table for the conversation, and now we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into specifics around what are the practices that allow us to achieve this compliance and oversight mission, but do so in a more iterative and incremental, lean and agile way. And to do that, we're going to talk about 4 things. again, building the solution and compliance incrementally, organizing around this need to build compliance in more frequently, what that does in terms of how we marshal our resources together, building quality and compliance in, and then applying continuous verification and validation. So let's keep right on plugging, and Harry's going to take us to the first topic here, which is building the solution and compliance incrementally. Harry?
Great. Thanks, Steve. As Steve mentioned, the first one here is building the solution incrementally as a fundamental lean principle, and we're gonna demonstrate how not only are we building the solution incrementally, we want to also build compliance incrementally. So let's hit the next slide there, Steve. So here we're contrasting incremental development and waterfall. So in waterfall, we get one opportunity to get the system right. You know, we get one, what we like to say, PDCA cycle. PDA stands for plan, do, check, act, or plan, do, check, adjust. The notion is that we're going to plan to do something, we're going to do it, we're going to assess or check what happened, and then we're going to adjust based on that new learning. Well, we got one big learning cycle with waterfall. Along the way, you see waterfall produces specifications up front in a very sequential fashion, requirements design, etc. And then produce the solution not until the end. If we contrast that to waterfall on the bottom, contrast that to incremental approach on the bottom, we're doing things in parallel, right? Doing things more incrementally, where we're going to create a plan to do something, we're going to do it, we have a tangible result from that, something demonstrable, and then we can adapt based on whatever we demonstrate at the end of that increment, and we continue that process along. Well, if we contrast these two, there's two important sentiments to get out of this. First off is Agile builds the system earlier. And if the system's being built earlier, then we can start the compliance and activities earlier as well. So instead of the big batch of compliance, you know, that big bow wave of compliance activity that we have towards the end, let's start doing the compliance, the verification, validation, et cetera, type compliance activities earlier on. The other thing that it really that it brings out, so we need to bring our compliance folks in earlier, get them involved with doing those activities earlier. But another constraint we put on the compliance folks, sentiment number 2, is that those specifications are actually built out over time. So we don't have specifications early, and we don't fix and lock in and commit to agendas and goals early on in the system. Those specifications are going to evolve over time as we learn more about the system. Okay, next slide, Steve. So in addition to building the system incrementally, we need to take this slide really is trying to take a broader view of the product life cycle, so that sure, SAFE is optimized during the construction of the product, but before the product commitment, there's some kind of conception effort that happens, right, where we understand the business needs, populate a solution from a product perspective, do market analysis, and that produces a vision and a roadmap of how to realize that vision, and then initial requirements, designs, et cetera, initial specifications and that solution intent. And then the incremental development of that system gets feedback. Is that the right vision, right? Do we need to adapt, right? We're producing incremental solutions. Can we get feedback on those incremental solutions with customers and validated learning, those types of activities? We need to adjust our vision, adjust our roadmap. In addition, from a technical perspective, is the solution that we're implementing viable? Are there better alternatives we need to explore? Right, we're constantly getting feedback back into that vision, roadmap, and the specifications that are evolving over time. Then at the end, from a compliance perspective, we have a solution what we'll call ready there at the end of that product lifecycle milestone. It's ready, if you will. And now it moves into some kind of limited distribution, into trials or into some kind of flight test or some kind of limited use scenario, where we're getting more feedback that eventually gets realized into something that is certified that can be submitted for general distribution. And we're kind of showing SAFE. Don't take it as a hard line that, in other words, you know, if it's a medical device as an example, we just got done with some medical device and that goes into limited distribution inside of certain hospitals to do experimentation. Well, we're probably not keeping the 200 people team around to keep producing the product while it's under that limited distribution. We may need to do maintenance on it, but it's probably not the whole release train. That said, limited distribution may move earlier, right? We're trying to get feedback as soon as possible. That's our goal. And the fact that we're building incrementally, we may actually try to produce a product that gets into limited distribution earlier. So take this kind of as a guideline, but in general, we're trying to get as much feedback as early as possible as we can. All right, great. Next slide, Steve. Thanks. So we'll address this a little bit more, but SAFE is a cadence-based approach to an incremental approach to building system, as Lean and Agile advocate. So at the end of every increment, we are assessing how's the solution coming. Are we meeting our goals, our objectives? Are we working towards that vision and roadmap? So we're assessing our solution progress. We're also assessing the delivery progress. Are we meeting our quality objectives? Is this product manufacturable? Can we get customers to validate it, validated learning, right, and feedback on those things? And then the third item over there is we want to continuously improve. In fact, we want to relentlessly improve. So we're looking at improvement stories that come out of that PI demo at the end. Well, we want compliance involved with that as well. Compliance is going to give us guidelines about what quality aspects we need to be looking for and checking. They're going to give us knowledge and information about regulatory feedback. So we need those compliance folks to participate in these kinds of activities with us, right? Giving us guidance on the quality, the feedback, and then helping us with improvement stories. And SAFE builds this in at a regular cadence, so we're going to leverage those SAFE alignment events to build the compliance folks in on those processes as well. Okay. Next slide, Steve, which I think you take over.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, Harry, as you're going through that, what really excites me about that part of the conversation is it's really taking that fast feedback and that ability to pivot without mercy that Eric Ries talked about in Lean Startup. But it's taking that conversation out of the entrepreneurial context and really giving very large organizations developing the most mission-critical systems on the planet a sense of how can those kinds of organizations benefit from that same ability to develop smaller pieces, to even check the compliance in smaller pieces, get fast feedback, and take the learning from that and actually produce a better product in the end, which I think is very exciting. So the next topic really addresses, one of the things that I know in my experience, and Harry, you've probably had the same experience working with some of these organizations and having this conversation, one of the most immediate responses is just how different that is going to look inside of an organization and the cultural impact that's going to have, and people who work in this compliance space, who have roles and responsibilities for doing these checks, and they've always done it in the big bow wave at the end kind of approach. One of the first questions is, what does that mean for me? Am I going to be able to work in this new world? How does this affect how we organize our resources? And so we want to address that right up front and talk about how do you do that effectively. So first, we want to just do a touchstone on a concept that's very critical in the Scaled Agile framework and in Lean thinking in general, and it's this idea of a value stream. The value stream is basically thinking about a system horizontally in terms of the thing that triggers the need in the market that we're going to address, and that flow of activities that produce the value that we ultimately release to a customer in the form of a product, a service that we get compensated for, right? It's basic sequence from concept to cash, and that's a fairly well-known organizational construct in Lean and Agile thinking. It's all the people who do the work to build these systems that we're talking about here. And for this conversation, what that means is when we think about that ecosystem of all the people that it takes to build highly compliant, high assurance types of systems, that includes all of the expertise, all of the people that are checking and validating and verifying that the quality is built in the system, and it's ready to go to the customer, to the consumer. So in typical value stream conversations, we talk about how when you think of a value streams are these horizontal thinking constructs that flow across traditional silos in the organization. And in order to produce value, we have to have participants from all of those silos working together in a very integrated, transparent, rapid fashion to bring a product to market. We've often talked about the need for business people to work with software people or hardware people, maybe even testing people. This expands the conversation now to include in a high insurance environment where you have more more departments or more teams that are just focused on that compliance piece. We need to understand that they are part of the value stream as well, because if they don't do their work successfully, if we don't have a compliant product, then we can't go to market, and we don't realize the value and we don't realize the revenue if we're a commercial interest. So thinking of them as part of the ecosystem is a critical piece of this discussion. Now, in SAFE, we talk about something called the Agile Release Train. Basically, it's a virtual organization of 50 to 125 people on each individual train that are very cross-functional. So you have representation from the business, from all the different technical domains that are working together. They're planning together. They're executing together. They're demonstrating the results of their work together. And they're reflecting together, they're learning together and improving together. What we're promoting or proposing as a critical success factor in applying the rest of the practices we're going to address in this webinar is we've got to think of everybody as on the same team, and everybody is committed to each other's success. It's not an us versus them conversation. It's not a toss over the wall type of activity. So everybody has got to be committed to each other's success. Now, I understand that in a lot of environments that there are V&V, there are quality assurance types of organizations that by the regulatory guidance have to maintain some degree of independence so that their assessments cannot be biased. And you can still maintain that. You can be independent. You can still report to those vertical organizations. But that doesn't mean that you have to create artificiality of communication and transparency in order to maintain that independence. And hopefully,
hey,
yes.
Sorry, can I jump in one moment? So we did have a question. Can you just explain a little bit what V&V is?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go back to the slide that Harry addressed a few slides back, it's the verification and validation. If I'm going to just pop up here real quick. Hopefully that doesn't cause anybody a headache. It's this slide right here. So verification and validation, those are the definitions. They're pretty widely accepted definitions. And in practice, I know certainly in the government space and maybe in other spaces as well, V&V or IV&V is a typical acronym or shorthand for those concepts. Does that answer the question?
And in general, it's a relatively independent assessment. In fact, the IV&V, the I in front of it is independent, which may be a separate whole organization, not your business, but another business that's assessing the quality, right? You've said that this thing has met the specifications and goals. Let's have somebody else validate it as well. So it's not just a developer with their unit test that's validating the system. It's an independent organization. And V&V, verification validation, is the term that the community uses.
Correct. And in government spaces, that V&V or IV&V function is often performed by a completely separate contract, a different company, different group of people from those that are actually developing the solution. What we're proposing in this slide is that they can maintain that independence, but we can give them greater visibility into the solution that we're developing incrementally. We can give them access to things that they need to do their job more frequently, more openly, by including them in the planning, in the communications, and the ongoing execution and the learning that is built into the construct and the practices in SAFE for an Agile release train. And some of those practices are illustrated here on this slide. So things like the the backlog where all of the work is going to be represented. Well, how do we make sure compliance activities actually happen? How do we see how a development team is going to apply capacity, apply effort to the things that have to be done to meet the high bar of compliance? Well, we have to see that in the backlog, because as we all know in the world of Agile, if it's in the backlog, it may get done, should get done. If it's not in the backlog, it's almost guaranteed not to get done. So the best way to make sure that we do these activities and do them well is to use the very same construct for organizing work that we do for all the rest of the development activities. The roadmap, right? How do we ensure that the future systems, as we're envisioning what's going to happen not only in this increment, but in the next couple of increments down the road, that it's also going to meet those regulatory and compliance objectives? Well, we can reflect that right in the roadmap. And then solution intent. We're going to talk about solution intent a lot more for the remainder of this webinar. It's that artifact that has that collection of both what the current system is as well as what we believe the next iterations of the system are going to be. It's that repository of knowledge, right? And so we can bake compliance and regulatory concerns right into the solution intent, along with the customer needs and the feature functionality of the system as well. From a process perspective, we think about things like planning together, which we do in PI planning, right? So in the organizations I've worked with, I've encouraged those customers to certainly invite the compliance and IV&V and quality assurance folks into that 2-day big room planning event. If they're a team on the train, then they will certainly be there, but even if they're considered a supporting team, we invite them to be there because it just gives them visibility and transparency into what's happening so they can take that knowledge and then go plan their activities as well. The demonstrations that happen every 2 weeks, it's for system demos, and then the big PI demo at the end of every 10 to 12 weeks, right? So we can bake compliance right into the demonstration. How can we prove that the next piece of the system we built meets its compliance and regulatory compliance, regulatory requirements that apply to that slice of the system? We can demonstrate that. And then continuous improvement, right? How do we improve our compliance? How do we bake it in more frequently? How do we take lessons learned from the things that maybe caused a red flag or didn't meet compliance expectations? Well, why didn't it? And how can our development teams learn from that and do better next time and bake in, maybe through things like definition and done and some other things we're going to talk about in a minute, to hit that mark and make that compliance process flow and not cause stop and start in the development stream. So with that, let's keep right on going and talk about the next piece of this, which is building quality and compliance in from the beginning. So Harry, you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Steve. So Lean for a long time has focused on building quality in, right? We create a culture around getting it right the first time. We do that through automation. We automate everything, not just the automation of doing activities, but the automation of detecting abnormalities in the system. And when we automatically detect those abnormalities, we automatically stop the whole system, the Annan cord, from the Toyota production system. We don't try to optimize locally. We try to optimize the whole by taking a systems view. And really fast flow is a thing that reveals problems quickly. The faster we can flow things through, the sooner we will get to realize problems. So the goal is we're trying, instead of compliance being this thing or quality being this thing on the outside, bolted in, it becomes part of what we do as a regular culture. And we're trying to do that same thing with compliance, right? So that it becomes everybody's job, right? Or our team is embarrassed when a defect leaves. It's not just, oh, John messed something up. And frankly, just Amazon. Everybody's probably aware that Amazon had a glitch last week that brought down many websites, right, in their infrastructure, and they traced it down to an individual typing a command in incorrectly. And and you think, well, I wonder if that person got fired. That'd be kind of the culture that a lot of us live in. Wow, that guy's probably worried about his job. And in a different kind of culture, in a lean culture, Instead, they would say, thank you. Thank you for revealing that our system has this kind of flaw that a poor individual like yourself, unfortunately, would be able to cause this kind of an outage. You know, that's a different kind of mindset. And the only way we can build that in is through a lot of automation and automatically detecting things. So next slide, please. That's kind of our background and sentiment. The same kind of way we build quality and we want to build compliance in. So you see there on the left, right? There's the safe built-in quality little icon, right? What are the practices that we have? Well, traditionally the far left column is continuous integration, test-driven refactoring, those types of things. In engineering and other types of artifacts, we're talking about model-based system engineering, step-based design, frequent integration to building quality. But we also want to do the same thing with our compliance activities, right? Reviews and audits and sign-offs and verification validation and regulatory activities. We want them to be part of the regular flow. Just the same way we build quality in, we're going to build compliance in as well. Okay, let's talk about some of those aspects. So we're talking mainly about building compliance in. We're going to call out one of the ways we build quality in. And that call out here is with model-based system engineering. So, and the notion that an incremental system, and a system by which we're building the system incrementally, it becomes very difficult to do document-focused specifications. I'll pick on automotive because I've done quite a bit of work with automotive. They're on a 6-week cadence cycle. Every 6 weeks, they're handing off specifications to their teams or their suppliers and whatnot. If we were to do that in documents, how long would it take us to update the documents, make sure they're aligned with each other, and hand them off to the individual folks? It would take longer than the 6-week cycle to go off and do the work. So instead, we put models of the representation of the system, and we use those to generate our specifications. Right? So model-based system engineering when you use feedback, right? As those teams build things, they get feedback. We update the model to do the specifications for the next increment. And that's what those arrows are showing. Well, if we're leveraging models for our specifications, which SAFE advocates, we can also use those at the end of every increment to generate our compliance documents and assess if we've got all the specs in the model and traceability requirements and whatnot. We can pull those out every increment to do an assessment of how are we doing towards our compliance along the way. Can we generate our specifications every increment, the ones we're going to have to deliver for compliance reasons or procedurals if you're a government agent, if you're a government contractor, the procedural type documents that we have to produce as well. We want to assess those every increment because they're ideally, we're trying to get away from the PDR, CDR things, so I'll qualify this a little bit. We're trying to get away from producing documents. We deliver documents when we deliver the system. That's our end goal. Okay, that's what we're trying to produce along the way. So, thanks, Steve. Next slide. So we want to build compliance in the same way we build quality. And in fact, you folks that are SAFE folks have probably seen this slide before. This is the build quality in slide, and we've adapted it to building compliance in. So the sentiment here is that we don't want folks to handcuff teams by saying, hey, here's a check sheet, right? Instead, we want them to hand and say, here's how we're going to help you automate compliance. I'm going to take a step back here a little bit, and I'm going to tell you a little story. So in a previous life, about 15 years ago or so, I was a faculty member over at Arizona State University. And by far the best student that I ever saw went through that program and got a job with Google, which wasn't a surprise. Google's where he kind of wanted to work, and it's it's a hotshot place for hotshots to go. But he took a job with operations. And I thought at the time, 12 years ago or so when he took the job, he took a job as a site reliability engineer. And those of you that know about DevOps know what that term is in Google. I thought at the time, wow, that's kind of a career-ending move. All the exciting stuff's over here happening in engineering and development where we develop new products, not in operations where we deploy stuff and move tapes around and all that other stuff. Well, gosh, little did I know. I didn't have the foresight that he did. Right, that role ended up becoming critical to Google and Amazon, right, and all those organizations that do things with DevOps. They hired top-notch software engineers to come in and automate the things that happen inside of operations. So if you look at Google, in fact, there's a whole book now on site reliability engineering, came out last year. They take in applications and they automatically deploy them, they automatically assess them, they pull the anon cord, if you will, on those applications when they misbehave, and they go back to the engineering teams and say, hey, your application is misbehaving, and we either shut it down or we gave it limited use or we did whatever we're supposed to do with it. And that's all automated. So instead of software people handing them an application that they have to deploy in fits and starts, they've automated everything. And I think that's the direction we're going to see compliance. We want compliance organizations to quit handing us scripts and checklists. Right? Here's a checklist. We're going to run in and we're going to have a 4-hour meeting, and we're going to stop the flow of engineering and product development, and we're going to do my compliance concern by walking through this check sheet. Okay, well, let's not have a check sheet. Let's take the sentiment of the check sheet and let's build it into automation for security or safety or quality or whatever it is we're trying to assess. We want to build it in as part of the system. And that's what these organizations do. That's why it's surprising that Amazon had that error last week. Right? Amazon is a big DevOps type system. Usually there are checks along the way automated that don't let people make those kinds of mistakes. Okay? The kinds of mistakes that we can have, for example, I was working with an organization that they had avionics company, and they had 2,000 hours, I think it was, of code reviews that they had to throw out. Right? So they had piled up this big batch of code reviews only to find out at the end of that big batch, towards the end, that they weren't sufficient. Right? They were not going to pass certification. They had to redo them all. Delaying the release of the product to their customer, and obviously a lot of hours in quality estimation. If there was faster feedback and automated feedback that they were doing those things wrong, they could have saved all that rework. Right? They would have a little rework, but not nearly the large batch. So that's what the sentiment here is. We're trying to automate things. Yes, question?
I'm just going to jump in. Just to respect the time box, I know we wanted to leave about 10 minutes for questions. We do have some really excellent ones. So we have about 5 minutes until we're at that 10-minute mark.
All right. So I'll push on then. Next slide. Since we have another section to go through. So not everything can be automated. We have to do not everything can be automated. There are things like reviews and audits and traceability links, right? We have to have requirements traceability. Those are going to be manual activities. But again, we want to do those in smaller batches. We want to assess those. We want to do an assessment of those things every increment. Are we making progress at that solution demo that we talked about? But also that's feedback back to our quality system, right? The built-in quality in the QMS. Are we assessing things the best way? Are we bottlenecking teams? Is there a way that we can gather this information and produce it that doesn't handcuff the teams as much? Okay, building it as part of flow, but that's also a reciprocal need by the teams as well. Help us do the right thing, but let's do it in the most efficient, economic way. All right, and it's really cool. Before we move on, go back one slide. The goal is we're trying not to have this big event at the end. Historically, there's a large extended event to meet sign-off and compliance. We want to make that last event boring. It's a non-event because we've done all our diligence along the way. Thanks. Next slide. And so every increment, SAFE has built in a demo, a solution demo. We want to demonstrate compliance activity work that we're doing. There's also some measurements that we're doing every increment. Well, we want to assess compliance measurements as well. Code coverage, requirements coverage, peer review status. Don't do a big batch of peer review status and find out we did them the wrong way, right? Every increment, let's assess them. And ideally, we want to automate that, as we mentioned before. And then, of course, we're always trying to continuously or relentlessly improve. So is there relentless improvement activities around compliance? Is there better ways we can gather the data? Is there better ways we can automate it, et cetera? All right, thanks.
Okay. Well, let me see if I can land the plane here and we can get to some of these awesome questions really quick. The last thing we wanted to introduce was just this idea of the verification and validation process, that V&V. What we want to do is we want to get that from being, again, a big thing at the end to something that we do continuously along the way. We have a construct in SAFE called the solution intent. It really reflects that repository of all the different artifacts and the traceability of how things were built, and those are test plans, models, all that type of thing. What we would add to that conversation is also have it reflect the compliance documents as part of that repository, and build those along the way instead of it all at the very end. And we'll still meet the intent and the letter of the vast majority of the regulatory guidance that is out there. So how do we do that? What's the practical how-to? What does this really look like? So in order to continually verify and validate, we have some additional constructs in SAFE, and what we have here is the meta model. So you notice in SAFE, everything has a test associated with it, and as Harry just talked about, we want to automate as many of those as possible. But in this conversation, we're actually introducing something that's maybe a little bit new. Those that have had any SAFe training, you know that we've talked about this idea of enablers, the architecture, infrastructure, that runway of things that we need in order to build feature functionality in our systems. And we've talked about those, the exploration, architecture, infrastructure being the three kinds of enablers. Well, we're adding in this conversation a fourth type, and that's this evaluation and feedback loop that ensures that the compliance process, which the best way to describe that really is an enabler kind of activity, is reflected in the backlog as an enabler and has the appropriate tests associated with it as we're building it, and also as we're doing the ILLITES test that you see on the right-hand side. So it kind of looks like this. This is the four parts: the verification and then validation, both at the incremental, the PI, and the release level. And the last four slides really talk about that. So from an iteration validation perspective, remember Harry reminded us that this is the confirmation through objective evidence that the specified requirements have been fulfilled. We built the solution right. Well, the absolute best place to do that is in small batches, and do that in the iteration and have that done by the development team. Definition of done is a great tool that you can use not only for the technical environment but also for the compliance environment. So if you have things related to performance or safety or security that have to meet compliance bars, let's bake that in so teams can actually build systems that are compliant from the very get-go, and they can build tests that ensure that compliance, so we don't have compliance defects that escape the iteration and have to be dealt with down the road and create debt. Then from the validation perspective, also in every iteration, remember validation gives us the objective evidence that system performs its intended function. And here too, SAFe has built-in constructs that support validation, beginning with the success pattern of integrating across all the teams in the train at the end of every 2-week iteration. We want to know that all of the individual component parts that the individual teams have been building work together as an integrated system in an environment as close to production as possible, and that it meets all customer expectations, as well as that each incremental version of the solution fully meets all quality and compliance requirements. So we're going to bake that into our tests. We're going to bake it into our demo so we can show that compliance has been met. And this really then becomes a team effort. It's not just the development team, but you're going to have the system team that's helping with that integration, and other players become involved to make sure that we can demonstrate a fully compliant slice of the system. And then PI validation. So iterations are typically 2-week time boxes, and then in every 10 to 12 weeks we have the increment where we're going to demonstrate the full solution. Here again is an opportunity in the larger demo of what we've accomplished over the last 10 to 12 weeks to bake in that validation that we have in fact met the customer requirements. So both the verification side as well as the validation side has been met. We typically have a larger audience at these demos, and you can have in that audience the folks that are very much looking to see have those bars been met. In the 2 weeks where at the end of the increment where this demo takes place, we also plan for the next PI, for the next program increment, and we strongly recommend that those compliance experts, those regulatory experts, also be included in the planning exercises as well. And then finally, for release, I think everybody understands that release is kind of its own conversation, especially when, I think about that scene from Hidden Figures where the astronaut wants that final validation before the rocket goes up. Tell me that the numbers are right. And this is kind of the same thing. We all understand there's those final checks, those final validations that have to be done before something is finally released. And of course, we want to bake the compliance and the regulatory pieces into this last stage as well. And with that, I thought I had a slide in here about our Oh, we do right before questions. So Harry, why don't you give the summary, and then we'll give a little teaser about something that's coming up in our summit in the fall.
Sure. Yeah. So quick summary. Our goal is we want to build compliance in. That's what Lean does, is it builds things in, bakes it as part of flow. The traditional way of approaching things, which QMS is based on, the typical quality management are based on the traditional waterfall approaches. It kind of forces our hand into large batches, late feedback, and slows down flow. SAFE is a Lean Agile solution, right? It's got a lot of great guidance around how to be Lean and Agile, and we can build compliance in with SAFE. I think that's what we just demonstrated here to get our better outcomes, higher quality, et cetera. So next slide. And we talked about here's how we're going to take those Lean principles, like building things incrementally, organized around value, building quality in, and doing things continuously. And we're going to apply compliance and verification and validation to all those Lean principles and practices. And then next slide, to your point, Dean is going to be hosting at the SAFE Summit on Friday a high assurance training opportunity. So the summit is going to run that week, I think from October 2nd to October 6th, and there is a training opportunity on the 6th that Dean is going to run. So a good way to get in, get registered now. Registration is open, I believe, so attend Dean's training day on high assurance.
Absolutely. Bree, was there anything you want to add on that?
No, I think Harry about covered it. The training is going to go from 8 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. The summit will be in San Antonio, Texas. Last year's summit completely sold out, so if you are interested in attending, I highly recommend registering now while the super early bird rate is still good. It definitely promises to be bigger and better than ever, so highly recommended.
Awesome. Thank you. And I think with that, we're ready to handle some of these awesome questions.
Okay, so we do have quite a number of really excellent questions, and to everybody that is still on the phone, thank you so much for writing in. We will do our best to address as many of them as possible, and then for the additional ones, we'll do our best to address some of those offline with our email follow-up. This webinar will be sent out, so you will have access to the recording as well. So to get us started, someone commented in usually in their experience they've seen that there are only a few compliance groups whose time is limited due to the many projects that are occurring. So their question is, how would you incorporate them when they can't attend every sprint or every PI planning?
Yeah, so we've run into this problem as we do Lean and Agile. So what I hear when I hear there's not enough of, I hear bottleneck from a Lean flow perspective, that they will now become bottlenecks to the teams. And you can there's all kind of tricks with flow you can do with bottlenecks. But in general, what we're probably advocating is there's going to have to be more compliance people. Right? That's going to become a bottleneck. Same when we moved to when Agile and testing became, there weren't separate testing groups anymore. Testers were on teams. We found out testing became a bottleneck. So go ahead, Steve. You're going to mention
Yeah,
something.
I'm just going to add what I've learned, what I've observed, and when I've heard that in organizations, and when we actually tried it, the thing that they're not taking into account is the nature of the work changes, and now they're doing things in much smaller pieces. So they don't know what they don't know if they've never done this before. So that's number one. And number two, I encourage the folks that are experts in compliance to think about how can you force multiply yourself and your team. So how can you help the development teams build automation scripts, build the things that are going to streamline and automate the stuff that you would do manually, and that will leverage the human capital that you've got in a much better way. And that seems to work pretty well.
Great. So we have another question from Al. Could you address this question when appropriate? For some regulated industries, like the safety industry of SIL2 and SIL3, for every code change that is made, they need to show whether there is an impact on upstream activities like design and requirements. So do you have a best practice way to handle that in SAFE, where each iteration potentially modifies the requirements or the design code and tests?
Yeah, so I'd say and if we're building things in a lean and incremental way, it's not a if it's going to change, it is going to cause that change, right? And that's really what the solution intent conversation. Now the solution intent is not tool specific by intention, because there's lots of different technical solutions that give you mechanics of how this is done, and you can, we've got customers using doors and all kinds of things, but the point is it's a much bigger mindset change to understand that the requirements and specifications are going to evolve. They have to evolve, or we don't have organizational agility. We don't have the ability to quickly innovate and adapt. And so the regulations, yes, require us to have a document, as long as our processes give us the ability to reflect those changes back into the artifacts and the solution intent as we go forward, then we have that ability at any point in time, any milestone in the cadence process, to have in that knowledge base a reflection of the way the current system looks. And if you read the article on solution intent, that it goes into detail about those two sides of the solution intent, the current state and the future state.
And also, that would be part of the definition of done. If we did change the code that made a requirement obsolete, part of the effect it was on one of the checkboxes, update the solution intent. So we would expect that we always, at the end of every iteration or increment, we have alignment between what the system says it's supposed to do and what it actually does. And that sounds like it's a big bottleneck on the teams. Well, then we have to figure out ways of automating things and doing things that help enable teams to make those changes more quickly and more easily. The second thing I'll add, the only other thing I'll add to that is that sometimes I hear these requirements about back downstream. There's no stream anymore, right? In other words, that sounds very phase gate, right? We did the requirements, the design, and oh, you're changing something that we did in a previous phase. So we might want to question where that rule came from, find out the origin of it in the compliance spec, and say, is really that our interpretation, or is that something we can address in a different way? Especially when I hear things like phase.
Yeah.
Great. So we're just about out of time. For anybody that is still on the phone, let's take one more question. We will be sending out, again, the recording of this webinar, and we'll do our best to answer as many of the questions that we couldn't get to today with that recap email that we send out. So everyone will have those answers once we send that recording out. So the last question of the day is, are there any tips on how the compliance team can self-organize to support an art in which they aren't 100% allocated? Compliance team is out of your train, and they need to validate documents from many other projects that are running in parallel, so this may pose a challenge.
You want me to take a shot at it, Harry?
Yeah, so in SAFE, we'd consider those folks shared resources. In fact, we typically do. That's the guidance that I always give anyway, is that those folks are shared resources. We expect them to participate to the extent that they can with the planning events that happen and the alignment events, right, to make sure we're all aligned on things and influencing backlogs and whatnot. So you're right, they're part of the art, but they're part of the art through that shared resource activity. That's usually what I say. Steve?
Yeah, absolutely. And in my experience, the way I've helped those teams is they typically work best in more of a Kanban flow-based planning model. So their backlog reflects the different service levels and types of activities that they do with the various teams. They size them appropriately in the backlog, and then they build out their process as a team on the Kanban board. And then just try to create flow. It gives them visibility and transparency into their work. It helps them see where their bottlenecks are. It helps them crash on any bottlenecks and get flow back going again. They seem to catch on to that concept pretty quickly, and it makes a lot of sense to them. So that's normally where we land in the organizations I've worked with.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody, so much for your incredible engagement, and thank you, Steve and Harry, for the very, very informational presentation. Again, this is kind of just scratching the surface with what we could do in an hour. If you are interested in finding out more or taking a deeper dive into some of this subject matter, I highly recommend checking out the SAFE Summit and attending our session on Training Day with Dean Leffingwell on Friday, October the 6th.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.